Something does not add up. That is not a conclusion drawn by tabloids or armchair detectives scrolling through social media at midnight. That is the conclusion of a man who knew Brian Hooker personally, who sailed alongside him, who took his advice on the water, who trusted him enough to call him when his wife was missing. A man who recorded a phone call not because he was suspicious, but because he wanted to help, and who ended that call unable to shake the feeling that the story he had just been told was not the whole story. That feeling has not gone away. Weeks have passed. The searches have stopped. Brian Hooker has left the Bahamas. His sailboat sits in Fort Pierce, Florida, seized by the United States Coast Guard as part of what federal investigators have formally and specifically described as a criminal investigation. And Lynette Hooker has not been found. Her daughter is still waiting. Her mother is still waiting. The water near Hopetown, Abaco, is still keeping whatever secrets it holds. And the case that should be generating urgent, coordinated, comprehensive action has instead generated 3 press releases from Bahamian police and a silence that is becoming harder and harder to interpret as anything other than indifference. This is the story of Lynette Hooker, and it is not over. On the evening of April 4th, Brian and Lynette Hooker left Hopetown in the Bahamas aboard their dinghy. They lived on a sailboat called Soulmate. They were originally from Michigan. They had been living the live-aboard life for years, the kind of existence that strips away the ordinary noise of mortgages and commutes and replaces it with wind and water, and the particular intimacy of 2 people sharing a very small vessel with nowhere else to go. According to Brian Hooker's account to Bahamian authorities, rough water caused Lynette to fall overboard sometime during that crossing. He says he was unable to locate her in the darkness. He says he paddled to shore and arrived at Marsh Harbor around 4 in the morning on April 5th. He says it was a terrible accident. He says he had nothing to do with it. That is what he says. Bahamian authorities held him in custody for 5 days. 5 days. That is not a routine courtesy detention. That is not what happens when investigators are fully satisfied with an account and simply want to cross the administrative T's and dot the procedural I's before sending someone home. 5 days in custody in a foreign country means questions were asked that did not receive satisfying answers. It means something in the story required closer examination. It means the people who were physically present, who talked to Brian Hooker face-to-face, who saw the scene and the vessel and the man himself, were not prepared to accept the account at face value and wave him through. He was ultimately released. The Bahamian police announced the release with a brief statement referencing the parliament. And then, Brian Hooker left the Bahamas. He had told people he would stay and search for his wife. He did not stay. He left, hired an attorney in Michigan, and that attorney gave a brief press conference. A sit-down interview answering 3 prepared questions, asserting that Brian loved Lynette deeply and had nothing to do with her disappearance. Brian himself was not present at that interview. His attorney spoke for him, said the words, and that was the last significant public statement from Brian Hooker's side of this story. No one appears to know with certainty where Brian Hooker is right now. The sailboat Soulmate was seized by the United States Coast Guard and transported to Fort Pierce, Florida, where federal investigators conducted what they have described in their own formal language as a forensic examination in connection with a criminal investigation. The Coast Guard does not use that language casually. Criminal investigation is a specific classification. It means the agency has evaluated what it knows and determined that the circumstances surrounding Lynette Hooker's disappearance warrant federal criminal scrutiny, not a missing persons inquiry, not a routine maritime accident review. A criminal investigation. That distinction matters. Blaine Stevenson and his wife Marn met Brian and Lynette Hooker in 2023 on the water in Florida. They were relatively new to the live-aboard life when they crossed paths at an anchorage one evening while a storm was developing, and everyone was looking for a safe place to wait it out. The kind of bond that forms fast on the water. Shared weather, shared uncertainty, the camaraderie of people who have chosen to live outside the conventional structure of a settled life. They spent time together in southern Florida. Blaine and Brian had military backgrounds in common. The women connected immediately. Marn and Lynette were, in Blaine's description, symbiotic. Very similar people who recognized something in each other quickly and held on to it. They kept in touch over the years. Social media, occasional messages about routes and anchorages. They had been trying to coordinate meeting up again in the Bahamas. The timing just never worked out. And then, late on a Sunday night, or early on a Monday morning, Marn came upstairs where Blaine and their daughter were watching television. And she was crying. She had just figured out that the missing person in the Bahamas, the story they had been discussing abstractly as something that had happened to a stranger somewhere far away, was Lynette. Her Lynette. She called Brian. He called back, and they talked for an hour. Blaine was not suspicious at the start of that call. He says this clearly and repeatedly, and it matters that he says it, because the credibility of everything he observed depends in part on the fact that he was not approaching the conversation with a predetermined conclusion. He was a friend trying to understand what had happened and figure out how to help. He pulled up nautical charts. He drew on a whiteboard. He started recording the call partway through, not because something Brian said triggered alarm, but because the geography of the area, Hopetown, Elbow Cay, Marsh Harbor, the overlapping names and channels of the Abaco region, was complicated enough that he wanted to be able to go back and check the details so that he and Marn could organize a WhatsApp search group with accurate information about where to look. He recorded it the way people record things when they are trying to help, not when they are building a case. But by the end of the call, something had shifted. The story Brian told did not construct cleanly into a visual picture. Blaine is a visual thinker, someone who needs to be able to run the sequence of events like a film in his mind, to follow the movement of people through space and time in a way that has internal physical logic. And when he tried to do that with Brian's account, it kept catching. The pieces would not connect the way real events connect, with the texture of continuity and causality that even traumatized memory tends to preserve in some recognizable form. The life vests were one of the things that caught. Brian mentioned in passing that they were not wearing life vests, and then he mentioned that they had 2 life vests on the dinghy, the ones the Coast Guard requires, stored somewhere aboard. Blaine's internal reaction was immediate. You had the life vests. They were right there. In conditions rough enough for your wife to go overboard and disappear forever, the life vests were accessible and not worn. That is not proof of anything, but it is a question that does not resolve itself. The flares were another thing. On a dinghy, at night, in rough water, when your wife has gone overboard and you cannot see her in the dark, flares are not an obscure piece of emergency equipment. They are exactly what you reach for. They exist for precisely that situation. They are the thing that lets you see and be seen in darkness on the water. Whether flares were available and whether they were used is a question the Coast Guard investigation would have asked. What answer they received has not been made public. And then there was the timing of the light. Brian described the sun setting. He described then being unable to see Lynette, but the sequence of when the light failed in his account did not match what Blaine knew about sunset times in that region at that time of year, and it did not match what security camera footage from the area subsequently showed about the conditions that evening. The film Blaine was trying to construct in his mind kept arriving at moments where the lighting did not match the script. None of this is a verdict, but it is the kind of thing that, once you notice it, you cannot stop noticing. The weather that night is its own complication. Multiple boat captains who were in the Abaco area on April 4th have confirmed that the weather did deteriorate that evening. A published meteorological analysis supports this. The weather got bad. This is not in dispute. But the critical question is when it got bad. Security camera footage from the area shows that at the time Brian identifies as the moment the incident occurred, the conditions were not yet as severe as his account implies. The rough seas he describes as the cause of Lynette going overboard appear not to have been present at the moment he places the accident. The storm came later. This could be explained by imprecise memory under extreme stress. Time collapses and expands in traumatic situations. A man who has just lost his wife and spent hours in the dark water trying to find her might genuinely misremember the sequence of conditions. That is a real possibility that must be held alongside everything else. But it is another detail that requires explanation, another place where the account and the physical record do not align. In December of 2023 or January of 2024, Lynette left Brian. She sent Marna a message. The message said, in Blaine's paraphrase, that Brian had gotten bad, that he was angry, that they had built their lives together around this dream, but that she could no longer be alone on a boat with him. She could not be alone on a boat with him. Those were the words, or close enough to them. That message has circulated online. It is part of the public record of this case. Blaine did not know the full contents of that message until after the incident. His wife knew. Marn and Lynette had been in communication, but the specific language, the specific articulation of what Lynette could no longer do, was not something Blaine was aware of when he took that phone call from Brian. Consider what that message means in the context of what happened next. Lynette told her closest friend that she was afraid to be alone on a boat with her husband, and then she went back to him. She returned to the boat and to the life and to the man she had said she could no longer be with in that enclosed waterborne space where there is no exit and no witness and nowhere to go but overboard. On April 4th, she was alone on a boat with him, in the dark, on the water, and then she was gone. This does not prove murder. It does not prove anything beyond the tragic weight of a woman who was afraid, who came back anyway, and who is now missing. But it is the kind of detail that transforms everything else around it. It is the context that makes the unanswered questions about life vests and flares and weather timing and the flatness of Brian's voice on the phone and his decision to leave the Bahamas. It is the context that makes all of those details cohere into something that feels less like coincidence and more like pattern. The behavior Brian Hooker exhibited after the incident is something that the people who knew him have found difficult to reconcile with the man they thought they understood. He left the Bahamas when he said he would stay. His subsequent communications became sparse, then stopped. He arranged a lawyer and a press conference but did not appear at it himself. He had the sailboat moved to Florida, a logistically complex and expensive operation that created the appearance of engagement and accountability without Brian Hooker himself being anywhere that anyone could see him or question him. Blaine describes this as a magician's trick. Look, I am here, but he was not there. The political dimension of Brian's social media presence is something Blaine raises not as evidence, but as texture. Brian was, in Blaine's characterization, the most politically aggressive person in his entire social media feed across several years of American political turbulence. Not someone who held views and shared them thoughtfully. Someone who pushed, who closed down even sympathetic perspectives that approached his positions from a slightly different angle, who projected a rigidity and combativeness that Blaine initially read as passion. Looking back, Blaine sees it differently. He sees it as a window into a personality capable of a particular kind of anger that may not have stayed confined to political arguments. He is careful about this. He does not say it is proof. He says it is a texture he noticed and that he now reads differently than he did before. What the forensic examination of Soulmate found has not been made public. The results of the Coast Guard's criminal investigation are under seal, as they should be in an active case where disclosure could compromise prosecution. What has been confirmed is that federal investigators went through the vessel with the tools and methodology of a forensic examination. Whatever they were looking for, blood evidence, DNA, signs of struggle, material inconsistencies with the account Brian Hooker gave, they looked for it. Whether they found it is something we do not yet know. The phone records would tell a story. Geolocation data from whatever devices Brian and Lynette were carrying that evening would tell a more precise story. The pattern of calls made and received in the hours before and after the reported incident, the movement of devices through the geography of the Abaco region, the digital footprint of what happened that night. These are the kinds of evidence that modern investigations use, and in a case that has attracted federal criminal scrutiny, it would be remarkable if they had not been subpoenaed and analyzed. What investigators know and we do not is, by definition, unknown to us, but the fact of the investigation, the specific language used, the seizure of the vessel, the forensic examination, tells us something about what they believe may have happened, even without telling us what they found. The search failure in this case is its own separate tragedy layered on top of everything else. Bahamian search and rescue went out on Sunday morning, the morning after the incident, and searched for approximately 3 hours. And then, as far as the public record shows, the formal organized search stopped. In the days that followed, while Brian Hooker was in custody and unable to direct any search effort himself, while his friends were trying to coordinate volunteers through WhatsApp groups using the information from Blaine's recorded phone call, the official apparatus for finding a missing person in those waters does not appear to have been deployed again in any sustained or comprehensive way. The coordination failures in the early days were staggering. Ashley Banfield, covering the case for a national media outlet, was the one who obtained a photograph showing what Lynette was wearing the night she disappeared and brought that photograph to search and rescue personnel. The Bahamian authorities had security camera footage from the Abaco region that would have shown exactly what Lynette was wearing. That footage was never shared with their own search and rescue teams. A journalist bridged an information gap that should not have existed in a domestic investigation. Blaine was on the phone with Darlene, Lynette's mother. He had been talking with Carly, Lynette's daughter. There was and remains consensus among the people who loved Lynette that a real search needs to happen, not the 3 hours that took place on Sunday morning. A comprehensive, professional, systematic search of the cays and channels and shores of the Abaco region, conducted with the family present, with professionals who know how to read currents and drift patterns and the way the water moves things over time. That search requires permission from the Bahamian government. It has not been granted. The Bahamian police have issued 3 press releases, one announcing that a woman went missing, one announcing Brian Hooker's arrest, one announcing his release. 3 statements for a case involving a missing American woman, an international media presence, a U.S. federal criminal investigation, and a family making public appeals for answers. 3 statements, and then silence. That silence has meaning. Whether it means the Bahamian authorities know something they have not disclosed, Whether it means the investigation is active in ways that are simply not public, whether it means the systems are simply not functioning the way they should, we do not know. But the silence is real, and it is prolonged, and it is doing real damage to real people who are trying to get answers that the silence is making impossible to find. Blaine Stevenson ends his account with a clarity that cuts through everything else. He has been careful throughout, careful not to accuse Brian of anything specific, careful to acknowledge the limits of his own knowledge and his own speculation, careful to present his doubts as doubts and not as certainties. But when he gets to the point about Carly, the carefulness gives way to something more direct. Carly is 28 years old. Every green dry bag that washes up on a Bahamian shore for the next 10 years is going to reopen something in her. Every news alert, every development in the case, every time someone finds something in the water near Abaco, is going to be a new wound in a woman who is already carrying more than she should have to carry at 28. The only thing that can limit that damage is finding Lynette, not arresting Brian, not closing the criminal case, finding Lynette, knowing where she is and what happened to her, and bringing her home in whatever form that is still possible. That is the thing Blaine wants. Not justice in the abstract, not a guilty verdict, a body, a location, an answer, the thing that lets a daughter stop waiting and start grieving properly, with something real to hold on to, instead of a void that refills itself with horror every time the ocean gives something up. He is right that finding Lynette is independent of convicting Brian. He is right that the two things are related, but not the same thing. A comprehensive search of the Abaco region would serve the family regardless of what it means for the criminal investigation. It would answer the question that Carly is living with every day, regardless of whether the answer also happens to constitute evidence in a prosecution. The bureaucratic wall between wanting to search and being allowed to search is real, and it has not moved. The family is pressing against it. Blaine is pressing against it. The media attention on this case has not dislodged it, and every day that the wall stands is a day that whatever physical evidence of Lynette's fate exists in those waters is subject to the currents and the time and the particular patience of the ocean, which does not care about criminal investigations or family grief or the difference between knowing and not knowing. Lynette Hooker left Hopetown on a dinghy on the night of April 4th and did not come back. Her husband came back alone with a story that his friend could not make cohere into a picture. The U.S. Coast Guard is conducting a criminal investigation. The sailboat they shared has been forensically examined. The Bahamian police have gone silent. Brian Hooker's location is unknown to the public. The search has not been conducted at the scale the situation demands. And the woman at the center of all of it, the woman whose fate is the actual point of all of it, has not been found. This case is not closed. The investigation is ongoing. The evidence has not yet assembled itself into the form required for prosecution, which means either the evidence is still being developed, or the threshold has not yet been reached, or the case is more complex than the available public information allows us to understand. None of those possibilities means the matter has been resolved. None of them means anyone has accepted that this was simply an accident, that Brian Hooker told the truth, that the questions raised by his friend and by the physical record of that night have satisfying answers. The questions are still there, the investigation is still running, the family is still waiting, and somewhere in the Bahamas, in the water, or on the shore of an island that no one has yet searched properly, there may be an answer that changes everything. Lynette Hooker, missing since April 4th, the waters near Hopetown, Abaco, the Bahamas, a real woman, a real family, a case that has not ended simply because the searches have stopped and the public statements have dried up, and the man who came back without her has gone somewhere that no one can seem to find him. The search for truth in this case has not concluded. It has barely begun in the ways that matter most. There is still something to find. There are still people looking. And the truth about what happened on that dinghy, in that darkness, on that water, has not yet fully surfaced. It may yet. Cases like this rarely stay permanently sealed. Evidence accumulates. People talk. Technology finds things that human observation missed. The patience of investigators who believe they know what happened but cannot yet prove it is, in many cases, eventually rewarded. The patience of families is a different thing entirely. It costs more. It extracts more. Every day that passes without an answer is a day that Carly does not know what happened to her mother. Every day is a day that Darlene carries something no parent should carry, the not knowing, which is worse in its way than the knowing, because the knowing has a shape and the not knowing is boundless. This is not just a story, it is a real life. A real mother, a real daughter, a real friend who recorded a phone call because he wanted to help, and who has not been able to walk away from what he heard on it. A real investigation that used the word criminal and meant it. The search for Lynette Hooker continues. It must, because on the other side of this silence, somewhere in the blue water of the Bahamas, there is an answer that belongs to her family, and they have not stopped looking. The distance from Hopetown to Marsh Harbor is navigable. The currents in the area, while variable and affected by tide, are not the kind of overwhelming oceanic forces that would make it impossible to track the likely drift of someone who entered the water at a known point at a known time. The area is dotted with small cays, some uninhabited, some barely inhabited, where someone who made it out of the water and onto land could potentially survive for days. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, Blaine and others held on to the possibility that Lynette might still be alive, that she had made it to one of those cays, that she was there, dehydrated and waiting, while the official apparatus moved too slowly and the voluntary search was constrained by the limits of information and resources and Bahamian bureaucratic inertia. That window, the window in which a survivor might still be found, closed without being fully searched. Whether Lynette was ever on one of those islands, whether she entered the water alive and remained alive long enough to reach land, is something we do not know. What we know is that the search that might have answered that question did not happen at the pace and scale and comprehensiveness that the situation demanded. The 3 hours of official search and rescue activity on Sunday morning was not sufficient. Everyone who knows the area and knows maritime survival dynamics understands that it was not sufficient, and the silence of the Bahamian authorities in response to calls for a more comprehensive effort has never been adequately explained. There is also the matter of who Brian Hooker is as a person. Beyond the surface of what this case has made visible, Blaine describes him as someone with more sailing knowledge than Blaine had when they met, someone who gave useful, practical advice, someone whose military background created a certain kind of common ground between them. He describes Brian as experienced on the water, experienced enough that the kind of basic boat handling involved in operating a dinghy at night should not have been beyond him, experienced enough that he should have been familiar with the emergency equipment and protocols that apply when someone goes overboard. This cuts two ways. An experienced boater who loses his wife to a freak accident in deteriorating conditions is more understandable than a novice making beginner mistakes. Experienced sailors have died in circumstances that seemed manageable until they suddenly were not. Experience does not confer immunity from tragedy, but experience also means that someone who claims a freak accident should be able to explain the sequence of events in a way that is consistent with what an experienced boater would actually do in that situation. Reaching for emergency equipment, using flares, making a distress call. The steps that trained, experienced people on the water are conditioned to take when things go wrong are not steps that shock or grief should erase from memory entirely. They are procedural responses, almost automatic. The fact that the account Brian gave did not straightforwardly account for those steps, the fact that the story left gaps around exactly those procedural moments where an experienced boater's behavior would be most predictable, is something that Blaine noticed. It is something that trained investigators would notice. What Blaine does not say, and what it is worth noting that he does not say, is that he has personal certainty about what happened. He says the story does not add up. He says the behavior since does not look like the behavior of a man processing the loss of someone he loved. He says he wants to find Lynette regardless of what Brian did or did not do. He says his place is not to determine guilt, but to advocate for search. He holds the question open in a way that is either genuinely uncertain or disciplined, and possibly both. That discipline matters, because the easy path in a case like this, the path that social media and the true crime ecosystem tends to push people toward, is certainty, is the clean narrative where the guilty party is identified and the community agrees, and the case becomes a story with a clear villain and a clear victim and a clear moral. The harder path is holding the uncertainty, acknowledging that what is known is not the same as what is true, and refusing to collapse the complexity of a real investigation into the satisfying simplicity of a verdict that has not been rendered. The criminal investigation is holding that uncertainty too. The Coast Guard has not charged Brian Hooker. The Bahamian authorities have not charged him. The investigation is ongoing, which means that the evidence, as of the time this account is being assembled, has not reached the threshold required to bring someone before a court. That does not mean he is innocent. It means the case is still being built, or that the evidence is ambiguous, or that some critical piece of information has not yet surfaced. Active investigations do not announce their conclusions before they reach them. The silence of an ongoing investigation is not the same as the silence of a case that has been shelved. What the criminal investigation's existence does tell us is that the agencies with the authority and resources to make this determination, the United States Coast Guard, with forensic specialists and investigative capacity and federal jurisdiction over maritime matters involving American vessels, looked at this case and did not classify it as an accidental drowning. They classified it as a criminal matter. That classification came from professionals who examined the vessel, reviewed the available evidence, and applied their institutional expertise and legal standards to what they found. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything in terms of what the public record has established so far. The official determination, to the extent that one has been made, is that something about this case is criminal. The question of what that means specifically, and for whom, and on what evidentiary basis is the question that the ongoing investigation is working to answer. Lynette's daughter, Carly, has been present throughout this public unfolding of the case in a way that is both inevitable and heartbreaking. She is 28. She is watching a criminal investigation into her father's possible role in her mother's disappearance unfold in public, with all of the media attention and social media speculation and true crime community engagement that a case like this generates. She is trying to find her mother while simultaneously navigating the possibility that the person responsible for her mother's disappearance is someone she has known her entire life. The psychological weight of that, the particular kind of grief that has no clean object because the person who might be responsible is also someone you love, or loved, or are trying to understand in a new and terrible light, is something that clinical language cannot fully capture. It is a weight that only resolution can lift, even partially, and resolution requires finding Lynette. It requires a search. It requires the Bahamian government to authorize the kind of comprehensive, professional, family-present effort that Blaine and Darlene have been requesting. That authorization has not come. The United States government's ability to compel the Bahamian government is limited. The diplomatic channels available for applying pressure in a case like this move slowly. The media attention that might create public pressure on Bahamian authorities to act has been real and sustained, but it has not yet produced the outcome the family needs. The wheels of international cooperation in missing persons cases involving foreign nationals on foreign soil move at a pace that is entirely incompatible with the urgency of grief and the decay of physical evidence over time. Every week that passes without a search is a week that the tides and currents of the Abaco region do what they do to whatever is in the water. Every week is a week that the Bahamian sun and the Bahamian ocean work on physical evidence in ways that are irreversible. The window for recovering Lynette in a condition that would allow definitive forensic analysis, the window for recovering answers along with her remains, may already be narrowing in ways that can never be reopened. This is the urgency that Blaine is trying to communicate, not the urgency of justice for Brian, though that matters too. The urgency of time, of the ocean, of what happens to evidence and remains when weeks become months and months accumulate without action. He has the knowledge of someone who lives on the water, who understands what the sea does to things over time, who can calculate in practical terms what is being lost every day that the search does not happen. He is not wrong. And the people who need to hear that message, the Bahamian authorities, the diplomatic channels between the U.S. and the Bahamas, whoever has the authority to authorize a proper search, have not yet responded to it in the way it deserves. Lynette Hooker went out on the water on the night of April 4th with her husband and did not come back. The man who came back without her told a story that the people closest to him could not make cohere. Federal investigators classified the case as criminal and examined the vessel forensically. The searches that happened were insufficient and have stopped. The family is pushing for more. The bureaucratic wall has not moved. This is where the case stands. Open, active, unresolved, with a family waiting on one side of that wall and answers waiting on the other, in the water and on the shores of the Bahamas, in the sealed results of a Coast Guard investigation, in whatever the forensic examination of Soulmate revealed. The truth is still out there. The people who love Lynette have not given up. The investigators have not closed their files, and somewhere in the quiet of the Abaco region, in water that does not care about investigations or grief, or the difference between accident and intent, there is something that needs to be found. This is not just a story. This is a real life, a real family, and a case that may still have answers waiting to be recovered from the deep. The search for truth continues.